The story is familiar, with a twist. It's February in Ukraine, but the start of the year has not been a happy one for those living there. Tensions are high in Kyiv, and there is a feeling that what happens over the next few days could alter Ukraine's political trajectory forever. In happier places elsewhere, the Olympics are in full swing. But back in Russia, the Kremlin is finalizing plans to capture territory that is internationally recognized as Ukrainian. Military planners believe that a quick victory is possible, and that Ukrainian citizens will treat Russian soldiers as liberators. Likewise, they think that members of the Ukrainian military will not bother defending what they see as an out-of-touch government. Correspondingly, the Russian mobilization is on the light side. Instead, the Kremlin hopes that covert actions by the FSB will disorient and slow any Ukrainian response to a crawl. The whole thing might be over in just a few days. What I am describing might sound like Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, but it is not. Rather, we must go 8 years further back. These events from 2014 serve as a prologue to the events that now dominate the headlines. And rather than ending in a Russian disaster, it succeeded in a way that Moscow could only dream of. Further, the confidence that it instilled in Moscow may very well have directly caused Russia's major miscalculation when it went back for more, in a full-on invasion of the country. Indeed, what happened in 2014 may be the closest example to what Russia thought would happen in 2022. This is the story of the Battle of Crimea. Act 1. Crisis in Kyiv. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych became president of Ukraine, marking a major change in politics in Kyiv. Yanukovych had failed in his bid back in 2004, winning the first vote under questionable circumstances, but then losing to Viktor Yushchenko in the Supreme Court-ordered rerun. The 2004 campaign had been very much an East versus West battle, with Yanukovych favoring closer ties to Russia. Although regional fractionalization did not completely disappear in the 2010 campaign, Yanukovych had moderated his position in the interim. By 2013, he was ready to sign a European Union Association Agreement, which would have brought Ukraine politically and economically closer to the West. However, at the last minute, Yanukovych pulled out and opted to push forward with membership in the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia's trade bloc. This proved to be Yanukovych's undoing. Only a few blocks from Ukraine's parliament and presidential palace, Ukrainians took to the streets to protest in Independence Square. By February, things snowballed into what is now known as the Maidan. Government forces could not suppress the protesters. Yanukovych's ability to stay in power was no longer a sure thing. Over in Crimea, Russians were getting worried. The breakup of the Soviet Union caused a problem in Sevastopol, where the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet was headquartered. Back in 1991, Russia wanted to keep it, but Crimea was a part of Ukraine, and Ukraine had declared independence. The 1997 Partition Treaty ultimately split the forces, with 81.7% going to Russia, or roughly 13 of every 16 ships. In addition, Moscow would pay a yearly rent to Kyiv for use of the facilities. Shortly after coming into office, Yanukovych renewed the agreement under the Kharkiv Pact, which leased the base to Russia until 2042. This was critical because Moscow viewed the Black Sea Fleet as a vital part of its geopolitical strategy. Beyond patrolling the Black Sea, ships also had access to the Mediterranean through the Bosporus Strait, and from there, the Atlantic Ocean. If Yanukovych were to fall and be replaced with a pro-West leader, Russia worried about the Black Sea Fleet's future. Beyond that, the mere presence of the base meant that many Russians lived in Crimea. Some were the family of active-duty Black Sea Fleet soldiers. Others simply chose to retire there. And honestly, why wouldn't they? Crimea is beautiful, has a relatively temperate climate, and is full of Russian speakers. Yet more were just a legacy of Crimea's former status as part of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic until its transfer to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. All of this was occurring during a delicate time of Putin's tenure. Following Russia's success in the Russo-Georgian War, Putin's poll numbers jumped to 88% in September 2008. Sochi Olympics or not, over the following 6 years, those numbers consistently trended downward before hitting 65% in January 2014. In an absolute sense, that kind of number may still appear to be good. George W. Bush barely reached it following the declaration of mission accomplished in Iraq, and only plummeted afterward. Barack Obama started his term just shy of Putin's sagging numbers, and never exceeded them. Donald Trump never even broke 50%, and Joe Biden peaked at 55% early in his term. But 65% does not sound all that great, conditional on having quashed all serious political competition, and while controlling practically all media. Even if the evidence does suggest that the vast majority of those who support him were not lying out of fear out of retaliation, there is an implicit discounting due to the lack of information flow. Regardless, Putin was looking for a way to boost those numbers, and he was about to be given a golden opportunity. Act 2. Launching the operation. On February 21st, Yanukovych fled from Kyiv for what he thought would be the comfort of Kharkiv. However, the next day, the Ukrainian parliament voted to strip Yanukovych of his presidential powers, and he ultimately found exile in Russia. This was a busy time for Putin. The 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi were in full swing, and Russia was the host. Given Putin's predilection for winter sports, and athletic competitions more broadly, he made sure to be present at multiple events over the course of the festivities, which apparently Canadians were very excited about at the time. And in an act that would be dripping with irony later, he even stopped for a meal with Ukrainian coaches and athletes. Nevertheless, behind the scenes, he squeezed in this Security Council meeting on the day Yanukovych left. Russia's plan for Crimea was in full go mode. We may never know the exact details of this process, but the final decision would have involved Putin and his standard compatriots. Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, Director of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and possibly Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. According to Putin's official retelling of the story, the Kremlin convened a meeting late on February 22nd and into the morning hours of the 23rd. Watching Yanukovych flee caused enough concern for them to pull the trigger and initiate plans to annex Crimea. However, oddly enough, the medal for the return of Crimea, given to those involved in the operation, indicates otherwise. On its back lists February 20th as the start date, 2 days before Parliament stripped Yanukovych of his presidential powers. Whenever the plan did begin, it involved 3 groups. First was the Black Sea Fleet. Integrating them into the operation was easy because they were already there. Second was Spetsnaz and other special forces. The Kremlin mobilized them under the auspices of routine inspections and brought them to a naval base just east of Crimea. The final group was local Russian sympathizers. Given the peninsula's history with Russia, some Crimeans were naturally inclined to protest. The FSB was responsible for enhancing this part of the plan by recruiting more protesters and then coordinating their collective actions. And just in case there were not enough protesters to go around, the Kremlin brought in some from Russia proper once the operations got underway. Act 3. Taking control. Each of the 3 groups had a different task in the operation. The protesters were up first, beginning as the political transition in Kyiv was underway. Their goal was to create chaos. As a starting point, this would divert Ukrainian political attention away from the more serious Russian threat. But they also served a public relations purpose. Protesters could provide plausible evidence that the uprising was popular and organic, some of which it was, while obfuscating the role that Russia was playing behind the scenes. Even if the West would eventually see through this, from Putin's perspective, temporary confusion was enough. All the Kremlin needed was to stall the West's response until after Russians already controlled Crimea, at which point reversing the situation would be next to impossible. Meanwhile, the special forces were responsible for securing government buildings and winning political battles within the peninsula. On February 27th at 4:30 a.m., they succeeded, infiltrating the Crimean parliament building and raising the Russian flag. Parliament then held an emergency session, directly supervised by the special forces, to terminate the Crimean government and appoint Sergei Aksyonov, a dual Ukrainian-Russian citizen, as the prime minister. Lastly, the Black Sea Fleet's job was to hold off the Ukrainian response for long enough for Russia to deploy more forces into Crimea. Despite having the largest responsibility in terms of square kilometers, this was the easiest task of all. Ukraine had no ability to coordinate anything at the time. This is Pavlo Lebedev, Ukraine's Minister of Defense at the start of the crisis. He was responsible for coordinating the Ukrainian response, but what he actually did was flee to Sevastopol on February 21st, and he would later be in attendance in Moscow when Russia formally annexed the peninsula. Despite the critical nature of the position, Ukraine did not appoint a replacement until the 27th. Other defections further handicapped Ukraine. On March 1st, the Ukrainian Navy's acting commander-in-chief defected. Unlike the Minister of Defense issue, Ukraine immediately had a replacement, but he also defected the very next day, showing the deep problems with the chain of command. Both still serve in the Russian Navy as vice admirals. Overall, Ukraine did not deploy its army until that day either. Obviously, getting to Crimea via the Black Sea was a challenge, given Russia's ability to patrol the waters. But a traditional land entry was also dangerous. Only a thin strip connects Crimea to the rest of Ukraine. Just 2 highways service them, with marshlands and fields in between, and there is very little cover for advancing troops. Basically, it is a giant trap for artillery to feed on, something that still lingers in the back of the mind of any military planner today. Russia responded by mobilizing troops to its land border with Ukraine, forcing the Ukrainian military to divert resources to protect that line of attack. Ukraine was locked out of Crimea before a true military battle could even take place. Act 4. Annexation. On March 6th, the Crimean parliament moved up the date of a referendum on Crimea's political status. 10 days later, while Putin was attending the closing ceremonies of the Paralympic Games, Crimean residents voted whether to apply for Russian annexation or restoration of the 1992 constitution. The latter option granted more autonomy than the status quo under the 1998 constitution, which was not given as an option on the ballot. Within Sevastopol, 95.6% voted to join Russia. 96.8% of remaining Crimeans did the same. However, Russia exerted careful control over voting, and traditional election monitors, like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe or the United Nations, were not present for the vote. Put differently, the 95.6% and 96.8% likely overinflate the true preference distribution within Crimea. In our second bit of irony for today, Western polling firms indicate that the more popular choice won anyway, meaning that whatever manipulation occurred was unnecessary for the outcome, though it is hard to parse out exactly how much of those beliefs reflect perceptions formed by any influence campaigns. On March 18th, the Kremlin held its aforementioned signing ceremony, officially putting Crimea under Moscow's jurisdiction by Russian law. Outside of the Kremlin's reach, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68-282 on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, confirmed that the international community would not recognize the annexation, with just 11 countries voting against it. Those were Armenia, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, Russia, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, countries that tend to vote against the Western order. However, Russia's position as a permanent member of the Security Council, and the veto power that comes along with it, guaranteed that any consequential resolutions would fail. This is why the line on most maps is dashed. It acknowledges the de facto status quo, but also reflects the international legal consensus. Regardless of that international legal wrangling, Ukrainian soldiers in Crimea were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Russia offered to give commissions at equal rank among those who defected. Those who refused were granted safe passage out of the peninsula. Moscow had no interest in inciting Ukraine to start a broad war by executing what effectively were hostages. The last thing anyone in the Kremlin wanted was to turn a celebration into a bloody quagmire. All told, about half of the Ukrainian troops in Crimea opted for defection, taking a substantial quantity of equipment with them. On March 24th, Kyiv ordered a complete withdrawal from Crimea. Strategically, the most difficult problem was deciding what to do with the few Ukrainian ships that Russia had not yet captured. Remember, Sevastopol was the Ukrainian Navy's headquarters as well, a legacy of the Soviet era. Ukraine ultimately chose Odessa as its Navy's new home. That said, the withdrawal as a whole was not an official political concession. In fact, Ukraine still describes the situation as the temporary occupation of Crimea. Whether it will be temporary or not remains to be seen. But by April 2014, it was clear that Russia had won the Battle of Crimea. Epilogue. From a domestic popularity perspective, the annexation of Crimea may represent the pinnacle of Putin's career. His poll numbers shot up into the high 80s and would stay there for the next few years. The streets of Moscow celebrated what they saw as the rightful return of lost Russian land, which was accomplished with almost no lives lost in the process. The Victory Day parade in May had special meaning to Russians that year. In the aftermath, their glow would mitigate the sting of the relatively minimal economic sanctions that the West would impose, as well as the dip in oil prices that came afterward. Even a 2% contraction of GDP in 2015 and 15.5% inflation barely dented Putin's approval ratings. But inside the walls of the Kremlin, the lessons learned were not the right ones. The central narrative that emerged over the next 8 years was that Ukrainians, with enough show of force, would simply wave goodbye to their country rather than fight Russia, and that many would outright welcome Russians with open arms. But what was true in Crimea did not generalize to the Ukrainian mainland. The war in Donbass, waged between 2014 and 2022 to varying degrees of intensity, offered a preview of that. Russia attempted many of the same covert tactics in supporting separatist movements, but a protracted and bloody war resulted instead. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine represented the culmination of this Russian thinking. That time, Russia's miscalculation led to the most destabilizing war of the third millennium, at least thus far. If you want to know more about the invasion, you will love my book that examines the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Alright, rather than doing something serious, let's try this one out. Could be a little bit fun here. Write a 100-word outro for a William Spaniel video on Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Be sure to include a reference to lines on maps. The tone should be slightly irreverent. Let's see how this works out. Okay, well, That's all for today's video on Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. As we've seen, sometimes lines on maps can lead to some pretty messy situations. It's like that old saying goes, the pen is mightier than the sword, but only if you're drawing maps. That's not bad as a joke. All jokes aside, this annexation has had serious consequences for the people of Crimea and the broader geopolitical landscape. As tensions continue to simmer, it's anyone's guess how this situation will ultimately play out. But one thing's for sure, the power of those lines on maps should never be underestimated. Thanks for watching, and it's even doing the outro. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more geopolitical musings. It's not atrocious, but I still feel like I have plenty of job security.